From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
This panel is going to talk about the reasonably diligent search and what it could be, what it shouldn't be, whether we should have it at all. And I know there was a lot of interest in it because the first panel seemed to veer off into it a little bit, but I think now we all have the opportunity to really kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what it should be or what it should not be. And so I wanted to start with just a really broad question about what should it be, what should a reasonably diligent search be vis-a-vis the 2008, yes? Oh, I totally forgot. Yes, thank you.
And then can I make also a
Sure.
point of order? When people answer questions, can they say their name before they answer?
Sure. That was a great suggestion from Ms. Prager, which is, so we're going to go around the table and introduce ourselves, just our name and our organization. And every time you say something, say who you are and what your organization is, just for the court reporter, as for the audience members who might not all be able to see your placards. So I guess I'll start with Karen. You probably know her already, but.
Karen Tipple-Claggett, Associate Registrar of Copyrights and Director of Policy and International Affairs.
Frank Muller, Attorney Advisor for Policy and International Affairs.
Meredith Jacob at American University and working with Berkeley on the Orphan Works Best Practices Project.
I'm Eric Harbeson from the Society of American Archivists.
Krista Cox with the Association of Research Libraries.
Amy Sabrin with the National Portrait Gallery.
Nancy Prager, Prager Law.
Nancy Wolff, on behalf of PACA, the Digital Media Licensing Association.
Ann Hoffman, National Writers Union.
Alec French, representing the Directors Guild of America.
Michael Capobianco, representing Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America.
Kirk Klaus, Attorney at Law. In my private capacity, I'm also in-house counsel at a network.
Jay Rosenthal, I think I'm still the Senior Vice President, General Counsel at the National Music Publishers Association.
Ben Sheffner, Vice President, Legal Affairs at the Motion Picture Association of America.
Jack Lerner here representing International Documentary Association and Film Independent.
I'm Greg Cram. I'm the Associate Director of Copyright and Information Policy at the New York Public Library.
I'm Carrie Russell from the American Library Association.
Sarah Michalak. I'm Chair of the Board of Governors of the HathiTrust Digital Library.
And thank you all for being on our panel today. And so back to the question, which is, since 2008, has there been some sort of general landscape change for the reasonably diligent search? I note that in our last panel, we didn't really talk about technological advancements, even though that was on the agenda. So it might be something some people want to talk about now. But this is kind of a broad, kind of opening the panel question. If you think that things have changed a lot, and not really in the case law, the fair use case law that we just talked about, but more in kind of the technical mannerisms and how we would do a search. So I'm going to open up the floor to anyone who has any thoughts on that. Any changes you want to discuss? Mr. Harbeson?
Sure, I'll lead. I thought that one of the things that has changed for us, for the Society of American Archivists, is that we've increasingly come to the conclusion that the definitions of reasonable in the reasonably diligent search are increasingly not reasonable. We have a problem here where the copyright balance is out of balance. We know that we have, the problem is not that we have we don't have enough protection, we have too much protection, and so we find ourselves with works that the public is needing us to use and not being able to. So I'd like to point to one study, for example, that shows how costly the definitions of reasonable diligent search that were in the previous legislation are. So the study is with the Thomas Watson papers at the University of North Carolina. There were 3,304 letters which were scheduled for digitization. The university had spent the cost in searching for the right holders was extraordinary. Of the 3,304 letters, 79% of them they determined were still under copyright, that had not entered the public domain yet. Of those, after a considerable search, only 4 of those right holders were ever found. After many hundreds of hours of searching, the total cost would end up being about $1,000 per linear foot. So when we're looking at archival collections that are several hundred or even thousands of linear feet, you have a situation that just is not sustainable if we want to be able to digitize the works. If we want to be able to make them available for the projects that the gentleman from the Wikimedia Foundation, for example, was discussing. So we feel that a reasonable search, to be reasonable, has to be cost-effective and time-effective enough so that people who need to make use of the works will actually make use of the law.
Do you think that there have been any sort of databases or other search tools since 2008 that have helped the situation, or are you saying you think that it's made it harder? Yes, and anyone else? Ms. Wolff?
Well, I think since 2008, and I speak on behalf of a number of associations that have been involved in the world of visual images and visual licensing. I mean, I think these associations have taken to heart that images have never been given appropriate attribution. They're hard to find, and we haven't sat on our hands. We've been working in support of what's known as the Plus Coalition to try to make search of visual content that does not have attribution be able to be found. And of course, it's a nonprofit, so the wheels move slowly because it's not heavily funded by any organization, but many organizations, users, and I believe Jeff Sedler from Plus is speaking on some others, but it's content owners, it's libraries, it's users, it's museums have all worked together to form standards and try to move forward, knowing that we're moving to a world where it's important whether there's orphan works or not to be found. But it is a big process to register and identify owners, but it's definitely with images, having a reverse search is helpful, and getting a registry, which is sort of next on the agenda, up and running and then get participation in that, I think will be helpful. I don't think there's any one registry that's going to solve all the problems. I think there'll be needed big hubs. And again, you will have the issue with the analog historic work that will take time, won't have the ability to be ingested as easily. I mean, images currently are now being created predominantly in digital format, so that will make some things easier.
Okay, I think, Mr. Rosenthal, you have your hand up.
Since 2008, certainly advances in content ID technology, I think, are very important in the context of what we're discussing. Certainly, it is far from perfect. Issues with YouTube and just user-generated content in general, which gets back to, I think, a point I made in a prior panel, that there are free market solutions here, and companies that certainly should be incorporated within whatever best practices, whatever guidance that an orphan works law could create. They must be brought into to all of this to be able to help and make sure that if you don't use these free market based solutions, well, maybe you're not really having a due diligence search. When we talked about this years ago, I raised the issue that for the issue of digital samples, there has always been a market industry out there of search companies that if you wanted to find the owner of somebody, well, okay, you get to them, you use them. Certainly if we're talking about uses of works on a commercial basis, that needs to be part of it. But I think that, again, these technologies would be very helpful in finding the folks, because that's what we want. We want them to be found, and this is part of the solution in our mind.
Hey, Ms. Michalak?
Sarah Michalak. I wanted to mention, in reference to something that Sally Shannon said in the previous panel, that the 200 works that the HathiTrust Digital Library posted in their Orphan Works, in our Orphan Works project, did benefit, that whole process did benefit from new uses of technology, i.e. crowdsourcing in this context, because a lot of those works were found, just as Sally said, she had found 2 right away. Many works were identified, had rights identification through that process. However, the project was curtailed because it was discovered to be an erroneous approach to finding, to identifying rights. Having said that, we at HathiTrust continue to believe that most works are findable, and that a diligent search, depending on what kind of subject area it is, what community the material comes from, and on the skill and capability and intuition of the searcher, most searches under those circumstances will be successful, and rights holders will be identified. Naturally, there are some exceptions. But we feel that since there is a strong record of libraries succeeding with searches for orphan works, it is not necessary to prescribe minimal search approaches, or to try to define in detail what a basic search should be, a truly diligent search should be.
I have a follow-up.
So do I.
I think, and a lot of people really do. Maybe I'm speaking for a lot of people with this question, but so if you could explain a little bit about what happened, so why were you guys not able to find the authors that some other people were? Was it, and why you think that experience wouldn't lead to having some sort of guidelines from outside?
The idea in the beginning was to put up a couple of hundred works that that Hathi felt were truly orphan works, and very short period, they discovered that they may have appeared to be orphan works, but in actuality they were not, because rights holders corresponded with the library, and again with the benefits of crowd searching, people who knew who the copyright holders were spoke up. So they began to realize that they were listing works that needed to have more detailed rights searches, and they took them down, saying that approach to the orphan works was not a good way to go. And those works orphan works are now treated as in copyright works in the digital library. So.
And I did have kind of a slight follow-up on that, although we want to make sure we hear from everyone. But do you think, in light of the fact that, after the works were listed, you were able to get, through crowdsourcing and other contacts, some guidance in terms of what copyrighted works were included and who were the authors and owners of those works? Would guidance about crowdsourcing or who to contact, some type of best practices that had been taken into account prior, would that have actually helped, do you think, in terms of reducing the likelihood that some of the orphan works that you posted were in fact erroneously posted?
I would say not. We are opposed to having minimum searching instructions or directions. We feel that there is so much variety among all of the different kinds of works that could be called orphan works today, that the searchers need to be able to make decisions depending on their sense of what sources to use. And it is true that some works require many hours to determine, but in the end, most works most at least printed and published works can be identified, rights holders can be identified. So we feel that the searcher on the ground, so to speak, needs to have the complete freedom to and intuition and knowledge to complete a search.
Thank you, and I think we have a couple of comments, actually more than I thought. So we're going to go with Ms. Prager, Mr. Lerner, Mr. French, and then Ms. Cox. So Ms. Prager?
Yes. One of the challenges that I'm hearing today is that this conversation seems very geared toward libraries. Let's talk about the real world and real users outside of libraries, because librarians have special skills for searching. I'm a lawyer. I'm here on behalf of my own experience representing a range of clients, including a very important cultural participant who publishes a music compilation every year on that highlights the music of the American South. I have learned so much working on that project every year. There do need to be minimum standards, because without someone like me involved that can help guide the process, there are many works that people would deem to be orphans that would go unheard because my client does everything on a most favored nations basis gratis, and they couldn't use it if they can't get somebody to sign off on the rights. This is, I'm okay saying all this. We go to great lengths to find these rights holders, including at times a group of kids that go into a studio in Mississippi or Alabama, cut a song, and that's the only song they have ever played and ever recorded. And to be able to get the rights to use the song. There need to be minimum standards, because other people would say this good faith that's part of the language that's been used that I pray today is removed from that language, because it needs to be a reasonable, objective standard that everyone, whether you're a librarian with years of experience or a student documentary filmmaker doing their first student film, can have some assurance that they are doing the research that will satisfy if there is ever an orphan works exemption. It has to be an objective standard. It has to be something that we can all look at and say and quantify that this was a reasonable search. Since 2008, there have been advances in technology, and we can discuss the registries on the next panel because there are a lot of issues with that. But I do really, really hope that we stop saying that this is a library-focused situation, because we need to look at it from a broader perspective. And that's all.
Thank you, Ms. Prager. Mr. French?
Thanks. The question was, what has changed since 2008? And we talked a little bit about technology, but there have been some legal changes too. In particular, the EU directive. And I think looking at that is instructive, particularly because one of the things that is in the directive is that you have to seek to identify all rights holders. That's part of, in a sense, a reasonably diligent search there. That's something that, frankly, reflects a proposal that the Directors Guild, in conjunction with the Writers Guild, have been making in this process since 2005, that you shouldn't, at least in the circumstance of motion pictures, have to look for only the copyright owner, but you should look for other rights holders like the directors and the writers. We have, in the European directive, we're part of that definition of rights holders. You have to look for us too. The reason why that's important is, one, from a practical perspective, we're easy to find. Look at the credits. The credits roll on a motion picture. You see who the director is. You see who the writer is. You can find us very easily through directly at the guilds, through databases like IMDb. You can find us if you can't find the copyright owner, and we can help you find the copyright owner. So it's a practical thing. It's also just because as rights holders in those works, we have a whole series of economic, creative, and human rights recognized under international human rights agreements tied up in those works. So the idea that if you look for in a reasonably diligent search and don't find the copyright owner, and that's all you have to do, and you don't have to kind of come and find us and account for the fact that we have under our collective bargaining agreements economic rights, residuals, health and pension contributions that go on for the life of the work, that we have human rights, that we have creative rights in our contracts, but also obviously under international agreements. we should be part of that chain of, we can help you find the author, the copyright owner, but you also should have to come find us because we have rights tied up in this that need to be accounted for other than the rights of the copyright owner.
Okay, Mr. Lerner.
Thank you. I want to commend Ms. Prager for commenting that this isn't only about libraries, although I think libraries are more real world today and more relevant to the real world today than ever before. But I represent a group of creators that depend on copyright protections for a living, and we're here today because we think an Orphan Works solution will benefit the creative community and society at large. And we think that the best way to do that is through best practices. And I think one of the differences between the HathiTrust experiment that Ms. Michalak was talking about earlier is that best practices, when done properly, are created by communities of practice, people who are both creators and users. So they have an incentive to try to try to actually find the rights holder. I mean, a lot of people want a license. That's what they want to do, and we're just unable to do that. And so we think that if you have an Orphan Works solution, and particularly if you have best practices, it'll actually end up with more people getting licenses and more people being able to actually monetize their content, both as original rights holders and as downstream creators who want to license content. I don't think, to answer your question, because we're still on the first question, right? But to answer your question, what's happened now is that a lot more ways to find rights holders are developing every day. And I'm happy to see Ms. Wolff here. We talked about this in 2012. The MPAA talked about this in 2012. There's a lot more ways to find rights holders, and all of these should be rolled into best practices. But one of the things that we don't want to do is have an ossified or a slow or a cumbersome regulatory regime that can't keep up with all of the developments. So I think we need lean, generally applicable principles that folks can then go into the private market and develop best practices around, and then actually begin to monetize those best practices, or not monetize them, but actually use those best practices. And Brad Holland said the market can move faster, and we agree, right? But the difference is that we think that the way to do that is through best practice. I want to say one other thing in response to Katie's question, and that is that we have is that not only have more ways to find rights holders developed and are continuing to develop very, very rapidly, but also more orphan works are now available than ever before, right? Not just because of the library projects, but because of lots of other ways. Content is being created digitally, content is being uploaded, and all of that is really greatly enriching our ability to create new works, right? And as rights holders, we're going to be the owners of orphan works. We're going to be, my clients are going to be subjected to the exact same regime. So we want the same thing. And when we went and created the documentary filmmaker statement of best practices and fair use, it was with that in mind. And that's why it's been such a success, because you have people with both of these incentives. They're creating these best practices. And by the way, I not only have I not heard of any cases that have been successful, I actually don't know of any allegations of specific allegations of misuse of any of these best practices. And I think that's the question we should be asking. How are they being misused in ways that actually hurt rights holders?
I think there's Ms. Cox, and then Mr. Sheffner, and then Mr. Cram.
Thank you. I agree with much of what Jack Lerner said about best practices being an excellent way forward. Best practices created by the communities that are familiar with these uses, familiar with the type of circumstances that arise, and best practices can, as Jack pointed out, can evolve to adapt to new technologies, new circumstances. Our fear is that by codifying or creating these regulations that are very narrowly defined or rigidly defined, that they will not be able to adapt to changing circumstances. It would be impossible to come up with regulations that will conceive of every possible circumstance that goes forward in the future. And we think that with a flexible standard, you can accommodate different uses, users, circumstances, because the differences between these uses, users, and circumstances can create differences as to the reasonableness of the search. And our fear is also that with rigidly defined standards, it can reduce the use of orphan works and result in institutions not taking advantage of legislation and orphan works becoming relatively inaccessible to the public, basically creating a chilling effect if they are too narrowly defined. We also note that, Nancy mentioned that she feels like there's a need for a specific minimum standard in order to accommodate users that are not libraries. But I would point out that fair use is a very flexible standard, and that's not just used by libraries, that's used by all types of users. So we think that a flexible standard can accommodate both libraries and other types of users and work really well. I mean, fair use has been called one of the most important safety valves of the copyright system, and that is a flexible standard.
I will let Ms. Prager interject for a
fair
moment.
Fair use is not a catch-all for every use. There are certain uses that are specifically not going to be fair use. And there are cases, so every time you have to go to court, we need, fair use isn't the balloon that's going to save everyone in this case.
Okay, I think Mr. Sheffner was next.
Thank you. Ben Sheffner with the Motion Picture Association of America. I want to take a step back here and talk for a little while about what we're actually trying to accomplish here. And what we're trying to accomplish, I don't think should just be the establishment of some sort of elaborate system, whether it's through legislation or best practices or whatever. The point is to facilitate voluntary licensing transactions. In other words, or the flip side of that, the point is to minimize the population of orphan works. I do think that best practices can play a major role and a very important role in doing so. I do think it's important that there be minimal standards. Minimal standards and flexibility are not in tension. You can have minimal standards, and then you can have, on top of that, flexibility to do what's reasonable under the particular circumstances for the particular type of works. I do think it's important when crafting best practices, I think it was Jay who mentioned it in the last panel, that they do involve all stakeholders. And I do think, I don't mean to put additional work on the Copyright Office, but I do think the Copyright Office would be a good forum for coming up with sets of best practices. Of course, they're going to differ among the types of works. It's one thing to look for the owner of a major motion picture. It's probably not going to be few, if any, orphan works. I realize the situation is much tougher with photographers and other visual artists. I do think also that it may be helpful not to wait until legislation is actually on the table or passed, but I think the Copyright Office, there actually may be benefits for the Copyright Office to go ahead and start doing this now. One, it'll advance the discussion. Again, it'll help minimize the population of orphan works by giving people who legitimately want to find the copyright owner instructions and guidance on how to do it. And I think it'll also give comfort to certain copyright owners who may be nervous about orphan works legislation because they're not sure that the requirements for a rigorous search are going to be rigorous enough. It'll give them comfort to see that these things actually work in practice. And I mean, as Jack was alluding to, well, you know what? Maybe there is not much evidence that people are misusing them. Maybe it turns out that, you know what? Once they have these best practices, they actually do a much better job of searching. So again, I would encourage the Copyright Office to see if there's a way that they could facilitate, the drafting of such best practices, again, even before legislation is on the table.
And I'm going to go to Mr. Cram next, but before I do, I wanted to say this is kind of going into the next kind of question I had. So, Mr. Cram, if you want to address what you already wanted to say, as well as this next question, and everyone else after Mr. Cram, which is basically, we talk about flexible versus rigid standards, and people are very concerned about having minimum standards. But as Mr. Sheffner was saying, you could have some sort of combination. And in our last panel, somebody mentioned the DMCA section 1201, which might not be that popular for everybody. But there could be things in which you could have some sort of baseline where there are, beyond a good faith search, maybe a reasonable person search, whatever the case may be, plus, having someone direct the users to the Copyright Office or somewhere else to say, here are what we think are reasonable this time. It could be through a rulemaking, or it could be through just we make studies every now and then, as we're doing right now, and something like that. And I wonder how people feel about that, both kind of a combination of the rigid and the flexible, as well as the Copyright Office's position in that, as well as other organizations. And with that, Mr. Cram, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks,
and I
Katie.
think Mr. Rosenthal's next.
So I'm Greg Cram, I'm from the New York Public Library, and the first thing to say is that NYPL doesn't think we need an orphan works legislation. We feel really confident with years of fair use decisions coming down that we feel comfortable that most of our uses are going to be protected by fair use. What we're really concerned about is an overly prescriptive search standard. We're really concerned that whatever search standard the Copyright Office comes up with or Congress comes up with won't take into account these technological changes. 6 years ago, Google Images search didn't exist. Reverse image searching didn't exist. We use it now every day when we're trying to find rights holders. So we're really concerned about having a prescriptive search that calcifies and ossifies, that doesn't take into account some of the changes. We're also concerned about having Congress try to tell us what the search standard is. We think that Congress is probably the slowest body to make these decisions, and even the Copyright Office, I think, it would be burdened by the amount of uses and the amount of works that we have in our collections and the various types of works that we have to come up with best practices for every single type of work. I mean, we are something of a unique library where we have 44.5 million physical objects in our research collection. Those things range from photographs, home photographs, to published works. And it's really hard for us to imagine a system that takes into account all of those types of works and the searches that would be required to get there.
Mr. Rosenthal?
First of all, your point about a flexible approach, I think that probably is the best way to look at all of this, depending upon the works that are involved and whether it's commercial or non-commercial. That might be a way to kind of separate the two. But 2 points I wanted to make. One is I wanted to join with Alec and talk about that as part of all of this best practices, due diligence search process, we have to keep in mind the artists. And I want to point out an example. During the last round, we brought this to the Hill, and that an example of a record label that you couldn't find the owner. The owner had fled, tax reasons, whatever, big legal bills, whatever. But the artist, that we were talking about a number of the releases of this label, the artist was playing in town that week. And the thought of an Orphan Works process going through a due diligence search where you just stop with the owner might not be the best way to look at this. We do have human rights obligations here, and we have to have that as part of it. And the last point is, just to make this even more complicated, we have to take into account termination rights. And when you have a situation where you have an owner not being an owner anymore, how does that fit into this? And termination rights in and of itself might be the main reason why we have to somehow bring into this discussion, should artists be part of this search? And what happens if you find the artist and you don't find the owner? That has to be discussed as well and thought through. I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but just to ignore it and not to have that part of the conversation, I think is the wrong way to go.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Ms. Russell, then Ms. Jacob, Mr. Harbeson, and Mr. Capobianco.
Carrie Russell from the American Library Association. We've been working on the Orphan Works stuff since probably 2004. We're the largest library association in the country. I collect information, case studies from all libraries, public, school, academic libraries. And I have to tell the panel that in my experience, the efforts that librarians make to identify a rights holder are very sincere and are very broad and encompassing, to the point that you wouldn't even believe what someone would do to try and find a rights holder. They also, if they can't find a rights holder, often refrain from using the work altogether. So I don't want people to think that libraries are willy-nilly digitizing anything that they have, that they're not trying to actually find these individuals. In addition, I think we focus a lot just on digitization, but in our libraries, we also have an educational role. So often we have instructors or faculty who want to use an illustration in their class. We feel they need to get permission. We can't find the rights holder after a diligent search. So this is also another socially beneficial activity that's going on with Orphan Works actually teaching. Furthermore, I wanted to mention that over the years, the libraries have been very aggressive in developing best practices, and I don't mean just the ARL best practices. I mean other lists of rules and suggestions. If you look at the 16-page report of the Society of American Archivists on how to conduct a search, you can tell that people are really taking this quite seriously. Meanwhile, our associations are doing things. We have, for years, created the actual bibliographic records that represent all the works that are published. Libraries have been doing that. We also have been developing tools to help people find works, public domain tools. Stanford's Fair Use site has a number of tools to try and identify how to find a rights holder. We have principles for digital content, a policy in the American Library Association that very clearly articulates that we respect the rights of rights holders. So I want everyone to realize that we do our due diligence. The problem with setting minimum standards is because sometimes you have nothing to do at all. You might have a work that has nothing on it, a photograph. You can't identify where it was taken, who took it, at what time. You have nothing. So if it's kind of ridiculous to ask people to look for facts that have never existed in the first place. So that's a problem with minimum search. I'll stop there.
I think Ms. Wolff probably would have something to say about how to find a photograph, but I will turn to Ms. Jacob, and Mr. Wolff, if you want to say something in a minute, that would be great.
Thank you. My name is Meredith Jacob, and I just wanted to start off by agreeing with Mr. Cram and Ms. Russell that having a single standard is very hard because Ms. Michalak said, you know, in the book's context, most searches can eventually be successful. And in our discussions with libraries and archivists, that's completely dependent on what types of materials you're working with, both the types of materials within the collection and the focus of the collection. And so for some things, like Ms. Russell said, there is no reasonable search to be done. There's really very little place to start. And in the context of the collection, you know that if you go at an item-by-item search, the digitization of the collection for access is impossible. And so in those situations, if there is a reasonable search standard, I think it will wall off large areas from the public. And just to follow on to that, I think the other question is, if you're searching for potential rights holders for objects that were never created for a sort of public purpose, it's also very hard to get responses. So you might be able to trace a group of letters and find out who you think the rights holders might be, but then get a very, very low response rate from those sort of cold calls. And so in that environment, having a single reasonable search standard would be very hard.
Okay, then Mr. Harbeson, Mr. Capobianco, and Mr. French.
So I'd like to again agree with with Carrie Russell. We do definitely go through our due diligence. But to go back to Mr. Rosenthal from the Music Publisher Association, the point about going back to the artist and keeping the artist in mind. The study that I mentioned earlier, where we had 79% of our these letters that were of more than 3,000 letters that were under copyright, and we found the University of North Carolina, the study found 4 rights holders among those some 79% of 3,000 were of the rights holders that were found. Most of them, of course, were more than happy to let us use the materials, and of those, most of them weren't even concerned about compensation or something. There have been other studies that have suggested this, where with things like letters, things with family snapshots and things like this, where there was never any commercial intent in the first place. There is no concern on the part of the right holder for, at least from a copyright standpoint, of receiving any royalties or anything of that nature. So this is why we suggest that there really should be, any orphan work solution really needs to take into consideration whether material was created with commercial intent or not. When material was created with commercial intent, of course, you don't want to go and, you know, there may be when material is created with commercial intent, the standard needs to be different than when there was no intent in the first place to exploit the work commercially. Thanks.
Mr. Capobianco?
Thank you. 2 points. One of the things that we've suggested in our submission to the Copyright Office is that part of any best practices or any orphan works regime would include a free voluntary author registry or database, presumably run by some entity like the Copyright Office, so that there was a place for people to actually look for these orphan works and the authors of them. The second point is, and this is going along with what Jay said, you must be searching for the authors. And this may be part of what was going on with the HathiTrust situation. I don't know. It would be interesting to see exactly what their procedure was that led them down the pathway to their incorrect assumptions. But in many cases, especially with book, text, artworks, the author is the only one who knows who owns the rights. And in many cases, especially when you're talking about digital rights, the author or creator is the owner of those rights. The publisher either never licensed those rights, or those rights have reverted to the author. So, I don't know if this even sounds like something unusual to everybody else here, but it's the authors that you're looking for. It's not the other rights holders. It's not the publishers. It's not the licensees. It's the authors.
Mr. French?
So assuming we're on the second question about flexible versus rigid.
I think so.
Okay. I guess I'd be a bit of a broken record and kind of say, the European directive, I think, did a little bit of both. It certainly has the flexibility of pushing things off to best practices, but it starts with the principle that as part of a search, you have to try to identify all rights holders, and defines rights holders as not only the copyright owner, but other rights holders. In our case, that would be the director who has economic. So I think you can have a mix of both, but I think starting from the principle I've heard reflected by a few folks, one of the things you should have to do, I guess I would say it is a minimal standard, like they did it in the EU directive, is you have to identify all rights holders in the first place and find them. Then what are the practices after that, I think, is where the flexibility comes in.
And I wanted to make a statement about a later panel that I think this might come up again, is the types of works that might be within an orphan work solution. And hearing Ms. Jacob talk about the difficulty in finding visual arts, I'm not sure what the solution is. I'm sure Ms. Wolff and others who will be participating on that panel will have a lot to say. But I wonder if it's also a kind of a catch-22, because if you have this many problems with a type of work, maybe should it really even be in the orphan work solution at all? So it can kind of cut both ways. And that's something that we really want to pursue. I have a long list of people who want to talk. So it's going to be Ms. Sabrin, Mr. Klaus, Ms. Michalak, Mr. Lerner, Ms. Hoffman, and then Ms. Cox. So I will start with Ms. Sabrin.
I'm Amy Sabrin and I'm here on behalf of the National Portrait Gallery, where as a volunteer, I am overseeing a project to try to identify holders of rights of orphan works. I'm a retired attorney, so, which I want to emphasize that a lot of public institutions who exist for the purpose of educating the public as to our cultural and historical heritage don't have a lot of resources to conduct, extensive searches, and visual images are particularly challenging, as you've noted. Minimal flexible standards, I think they have to be flexible to take into account the type of work that you're looking for, the age, because a lot of what we're finding is a lot of older works that still are probably within the life of the copyright, but we can identify the author, but the author is dead. Finding the rights holder at that point is very challenging. So the standard has to give you enough flexibility to say what's diligent in that situation as opposed to what's diligent in another situation. As a lawyer, I would caution, however, that I don't think you're going to get any more certainty if you have a flexible standard than you have now with fair use. You're going to have judge-made law that will develop over time about what constitutes a reasonably diligent search in any particular situation. So I'm not sure it actually does solve a lot of the problems that we're hoping to solve.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Klaus, and before I do that, I would love to see also how you view things with the Copyright Office or some other entity that might be able to help with these minimal standards. So if you do have, assuming that there is a way to do some sort of flexible approach that has minimal plus some rigid things in there, who would it be who would make those decisions? How would that work? And other comments you wanted to make.
So in a total commercial setting, especially the mass distribution of audiovisual works, hitting a standard that's both flexible and rigid, I think, is really imperative, because what that represents to a mass distributor of audiovisual works is risk reduction in the form of, if there's a risk or an uncleared right, the network or whomever the mass distributor is not going to distribute the work because the risk is too high and insurance companies won't cover it. Those simply exempt them from a policy, and the work that could have been included and distributed to the benefit of the public, of course there's a commercial benefit as well, will not be included in the distributed work at all. So by having a standard against which insurance companies, for example, and television networks can say, you know what, we've hit the minimum standard here, and there's some flexible items here we could also include in our search, and have that guidance, I think would facilitate more so the distribution of works that otherwise would not be included.
And who do you think should be involved in coming up with these more flexible standards?
Well, it could take the form, I think, of whatever you come out with first, as far as the law goes, and then in the form of regulations that might be added following forums, revisiting, what has worked in the past, what hasn't, in the audiovisual industry, what's important, the book industry, what's important, and in that regard, be flexible and build upon the base. And that could be facilitated through the Copyright Office.
Okay, Ms. Michalak?
I wanted to say something that responded to both Ms. Russell and Ms. Prager. Evaluating a work according to the principles of fair use is not just seeking an excuse to use the work. That, as Ms. Russell said, sometimes fair use review does not say, okay, this is a fair use, and the work is not used. So I don't want the idea that to remain that the library community just uses fair use as an excuse. There have been, I'm very familiar with the UNC project and the University Library at UNC Chapel Hill, and we have had some objections to digital works, but particularly in that case. But the objections often always have to do with something other than rights. They have to do with ideology, with privacy, particularly in a big collection of correspondence. And the Tom Watson collection has offended some people because his ideology was very difficult to swallow. So, and my third point is that a flexible standard can never cover everything. Couldn't even sit here and name all the varieties of material that are out there that where the rights cannot be identified. So the more you try to craft something that is flexible, it becomes either more and more detailed and therefore more rigid, or it will end up being so general that it really doesn't help for many of the different kinds of works involved.
Mr. Lerner?
Yeah, I want to respond and add to something that Mr. Klaus was saying. Jack Lerner, to say what Mr. Klaus was saying before. Insurance already operates based on best practices and fair use. And so what the underwriters do is look at whether someone has complied with a statement of best practice and fair use in the filmmaking context, and they issue insurance based on it. The private market actually is working based on these best practices that have been created by communities of creators who are also users, right? And so that's what we recommend. The way these standards are put together is instructive, and I thought maybe I would share that with the group and with our hosts. And what we do is we work with to create these best practices. The people that have created them have worked with small deliberative groups of people who are doing this work day in and day out, who have become experts in how to do it appropriately and responsibly, right? And then create best practices from those. So numerous meetings with small deliberative groups. In this case, it would be clearance houses, footage finders, licensing experts, people who are in the business of locating owners, right? The resulting best practices end up taking that knowledge and distilling it into what the important points are and sharing that with wide groups of people. And so in the documentary filmmaking context, what that did was educated filmmakers who had no concept of this, right? And took these users and helped them make responsible uses very quickly, right? And that's a really important education function that privately created, private market best practices have allowed. And ultimately, we think that with a statement of best practices for a reasonably diligent search, everybody would be able to figure out not just how to get the low-hanging fruit, but maybe the whole tree, or as much of the tree is going to be found, right? And just to respond to what Mr. Rosenthal is saying, no one is saying, and I'm certainly not saying, that might not include saying, look at some of the people involved with the creation of this work. I mean, if I have a photo of a person and I don't know who the owner is, maybe I would talk to the subject of the photo, right? If there's a book and I can't find the publisher, why wouldn't I look for the author, right? And so these are really common sense kinds of things, and those are the kinds of things that come out when you put these best practices together. And you know, I want to go back to the insurance point for just 1 second, and that is that one of the key checks on whether these best practices are going to work, and one of the things that enable them to work, is that there are lots of gatekeepers involved who are, to use a term that was bandied about a lot in the last panel, risk averse, right? Broadcasters, distributors, and insurance companies are very risk averse, right? And they've got to sign off on a lot of these uses, and that would happen with filmmakers, but I think it would also happen with lots of other groups, right? So we support. I mean, I think that the statement of best practices and fair use, not just particularly the documentary filmmaker statement, but other statements, are the greatest success story in copyright over the last 10 years and should serve as a model for how to handle orphan works. I think the fact that they haven't led to allegations of abuse, much less to findings of abuse, speaks for itself. And so what I recommend the Copyright Office do is support something that replicates that experience. Support a solution that allows the private sector to determine the search criteria, and then let the courts do their job, settle disputes, and let the law evolve. And there's been two terms used. One is minimum standards, and one is minimal standards. I think minimal standards make a lot of sense, right? Basic standards with flexibility so that they can be applied in lots of different areas. Communities of practice get together and let the private market take care of it. And that's going to be the most elegant, the most nimble, and the most flexible solution long term, right? And ultimately, it's going to lead to a lot more rights holders, songwriters, photographers, lots of people getting paid.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Mr. Lerner. Continue.
No,
okay, you're done.
Thank you.
Ms. Hoffman?
I want to speak to the American public. If they knew that people were considering making use of their family photographs that they're posting on the internet, or their internet jottings, or their YouTube videos, and thinking that they had the right to do it without ascertaining who owned it, I think there would be a revolution. And I hear, I mean, the use of letters and photographs, I think, is particularly troubling. I think they don't fit into a discussion of orphan works. But the other point I want to make, Mr. Lerner went through a number of directories that are available that people can search to find out who rights holders are. There are no such directories of creators at this time. And before we establish standards, we better find lots of ways and define a lot of ways to locate creators, or we will continue to be left out of the process.
Thank you, Ms. Hoffman. I think Ms. Cox was next.
I think that studies since 2006, when a lot of discussion was being had around orphan works, have shown that sometimes the search can actually be harder than expected. Sometimes the results are more ambiguous than one might expect. In particular, just because one identifies the author doesn't mean that they identify the right holder. And as several panelists mentioned on the first panel, that the elephant in the room is the age of the work. When you have these extended copyright terms, sometimes when it's life plus 70 years, that it's the author's heir or the heir's heirs that actually are the right holders, and it's not always easy to identify that. But even where the author is still alive, sometimes that work has been transferred, someone else owns the work. And so, the reason why I think it's so important to have a flexible standard is to accommodate the fact that not every work is the same, that over the life of the work, the reasonableness of the search might change. I think the studies showed that, particularly for archival works, that it is ambiguous and it is hard to find those works. And I think, again, as Jacques mentioned, best practices can accommodate this. It's not just about having a flexible standard, because you can have the flexible standard, but then allow the user communities to develop these best practices. We're not saying that a flexible standard results in a free-for-all. It's not true at all. The library community is very conscientious, very concerned with following copyright rules, and has responded to fair use by creating multiple codes of best practices and looking at these the new technologies that have come out in order to evolve and change and adapt to these technologies, take them into account, and also to take in new uses and new things that we want to support, like mass digitization, and all of that can be accommodated through flexible standards and best practices. And also, just one thing that I wanted to add to that is we agree with what Greg said. And from our perspective, we don't really think there is a need for orphan works legislation. But if orphan works legislation does come to be, we want to make sure that it's flexible enough to accommodate all types of users and uses and new technologies that come out.
And before we go to the next question, I have a follow-up that I want to explore. We talked a lot about the best practices issue, and I know that there are already existing best practices. On the last panel, there were some concern about the development of best practice in the sense that some of them didn't actually take into account the views of content owners. So I wanted to see, in terms of the best practices that we might use for purposes of a diligent search, for example, would that benefit from some additional support by the Copyright Office or others to make sure that they are done in a way that both the users and the content owners, who obviously we would be searching for, are comfortable with the type of best practice guidelines that are developed. So that's just a question I have. After the people who are waiting, anyone else can respond to that or the question that's on the table as well.
It is a good question, and I'm actually going to, I'm just going to turn to Ms. Prager and Ms. Wolff, who I think both had their hands up for that follow-up question. So if you could say what you were going to say before, as well as address.
Because you want to address that one, because I've got
my other things to address. Well, I do see the copyright, Nancy Wolff with PACA, Digital Media Licensing Association. A couple of things to address. One, I think that the Copyright Office should play a role in dealing with best practices and diligent search, because they will, and I think you can, take into account all stakeholders. Because when you have best practices just designed by either, library or those, if you don't take into those that actually own the rights, you may be missing a lot of ways to find a search. So I do think that the Library of Congress Copyright Office is very relevant and should play a relevant role. And going back to maybe some comments from the last section, is that I think there should be some basic guidelines from the Copyright Office, and then best practices develop that. So, for example, one, a diligent search should be made Two, that just if there's no attribution, that doesn't mean that no diligent search at all should be made. You know, something more has to be than just that there's not a name on a photo. I mean, there are many reverse image technologies available now. You can go to TinEye and look up images. PicScout has a reverse image. There's a number of organizations and companies that have been developing reverse image search. And again, the purpose of trying to find someone under Orphan Works is much different than fair use. With Orphan Works, if you do ultimately find someone that's great, you can ask permission, maybe do a license, and then if there is Orphan Works legislation, you rely on it, and an emerging rights holder emerges, they get paid fair market value. If everything gets lumped under fair use, creators and authors will never be paid anything, because anytime you can't find someone, you'll just assume, it's fair use. And even getting back to the insurance question, I mean, I vet a lot of works for documentaries too, and I think vetting for fair use and vetting for not finding and be able to find a rights holder are two different things. And I think, you can't just lump them all in one place. I don't know if this is appropriate this time, but also it's important that the diligent search is done at the time, before the use, and someone just doesn't try to reverse engineer a diligent search afterwards.
Ms. Prager, and then I see.
Thank you. One thing I think that may be a little confusing here is that we need to separate out digitization, which I think Krista's point about fair use, that's sort of her, I don't want to presume for you, but digitization of collections, which, Sarah, y'all deal with and libraries are dealing with, and I was sort of taking the approach of users of content for what I would deem non-commercial, but courts have considered what some of my clients do as being commercial, even though it's in a non-commercial context. So that distinction between commercial and non-commercial, to me, is a little bit of a red herring and also a little bit undefinable. But I do want to share something with y'all about orphans in the music industry, because unlike Mr. Rosenthal and the cohorts he works with, I believe very strongly that this has to consider music. Sound recordings, which are not in the copyright in the public domain in the United States and may or may not be subject to federal copyright. There's a lot of confusion on some parts pre-1972. But even post-1972, when there's clearly defined copyright federal protection. Let's say you want to use a recording of a band from 1975, and it was recorded on the ABC label. Wait, that could be a real label. A made-up label number one. And you have the disc, you have the 78 or the 45, whatever, you're looking at it. And you go and you research it, and you find a clear-cut history in the United States that label, through 16 acquisitions, is now part of Sony Records. You contact Sony, whether it's for a commercial or non-commercial use, and they say, what? We don't have a record of that. The record labels, the sound recording companies, have not been incentivized to go back and do a clean title search of everything in their catalog. It's easier for them to say no. There's actually some benefit for saying no to some uses. If they don't think they're going to get a high value, it helps their bottom line from an accounting perspective. Coming up with a clear approach to orphan works could incentivize them to go into their catalogs and clean them up and identify, yes, we do own made-up label number one through 16 acquisitions, because right now, I could make an argument that there are orphan sound recordings from 1980 out there, because we can't get the labels to admit that they own it. My favorite, I've been asked, and other people I know in the industry have been asked, can you show us the contracts that show we own that label? So, but my suggestion also right now is to separate, when we're talking about this, to sort of identify that there's digitization issues and then also use issues by commercial and non-commercial users.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. And I think, we have a couple of people, Mr. Sheffner, Mr. Rosenthal, and Ms. Jacob, and I guess when I call on you, and Mr. Lerner now too, the question being about the best practices and what, obviously Mr. Lerner's talked about, it was both the users and the owners who kind of got together and developed their best practices, but what other kind of coordination has taken place between the content owners and the users? And so I guess I will start with Ms. Jacob.
I just wanted to clarify earlier, I don't think that a rule based on photographs versus music versus written work is a good standard. So I do think that there are very different types of works in each of those. I just wanted to go back to that. But on the best practices, I wanted to agree with Mr. Lerner that they're a really strong tool here because they do deal with specific communities of practice. And so we heard a concern earlier about, the issues around the digitization of letters or family photographs. And the strength of the best practices project that we're doing, working with librarians and archivists, is it works with people who have experience, professional training, and ethical guidelines for dealing with those materials. It's not being created in a vacuum. So in these best practices projects, you're working with people who are already really very much in the weeds on how to deal with these types of materials, then you get to draw on that expertise. And I think there that the best practices model lets you work community by community and with certain types of materials, not only the types of materials, but the types of uses. And so it can create a closer fit than any sort of single evenly applied standard would.
The more specific question I think that Ms. Michalak had was, do you reach out to the content industry or content owners when you're coming up with these best practices?
In the archival context, that's an interesting question because they're really, in the issue of sort of letters or in the types of sort of ephemera in a lot of these collections, there is no content industry. And that's, I think, a part of the problem with that those people are dealing with is that it's a very different thing if you have you have the music industry or you have the film industry, but when you're dealing with things that could include, working memos, letters, correspondence, photographs, instructional manuals, parts of recorded speeches, that there isn't an industry to reach out to. And I think that the community of practice is the source of information about how to deal with those materials.
Okay, Mr. Harbeson, and then I will go to the other side of the table.
That was actually a lot of what I wanted to say, but I did want to emphasize that responding to the comment to my left, the archives community takes very seriously the trust that's placed in them when people donate letters and family photographs and the like to us. And so the archives community has spent a lot of time researching and worrying about the problems that come up when you make very, very personal documents available to the public, and we've been dealing with this since long before the online access issue is even an issue. This is something that we've researched very well. So I think that to the extent that I don't think that there's likely to be a revolution if people find out that we're going to be putting their family photographs or their letters or correspondence online. But I think to the extent that there is concern about this, what we're talking about here is a copyright issue, not a right of privacy issue. Those are issues that are best dealt with elsewhere.
Okay, Mr. Sheffner.
Ben Sheffner with the MPAA. One thing that has not gotten mentioned so far in the context of the minimum search requirements is the Copyright Office records themselves. One thing that we've said in our previous rounds of comments is that at a minimum, when people are undertaking a diligent search, they should consult the Copyright Office's records, registration, and recordation. I realize that doesn't solve all the problems. If all you have is a photograph, going to a Copyright Office database is not going to tell you who the owner is, but there's lots of situations where it will at least lead you on the right path. And I just want to commend the Copyright Office. I know you're undertaking studies right now about the modernizing the recordation process. I'm sure there'll be future proceedings on registration. I'm sure as a lot of people in this room are aware, records before 1978 are not even all digitized. And I think it behooves all of us in this room, no matter which sort of side some of these debates we're on, is for all of us, we should be doing all we can to support the Copyright Office in its modernization.
We agree.
In its modernization efforts. I realize that you have limited resources, but again, we should all be doing what we can to help get you more. And again, the modernization of these records, making the databases more searchable, more accurate, will again go to minimizing the population of orphan works, which is, again, I think should be the overall goal of this process.
I wanted to point out, we're having some roundtables in LA and maybe it's San Francisco and California at the end of the month. Ms. Sheffner was going to say something out. Okay. So we are having a series of roundtables on recordation issues later this month. If you check out our website, you can see them. If you're interested in that topic, you can come to those. We'd love to hear you. We're running a little short on time. I think I'll go to Ms. Russell because you had your hand up a little earlier. And then I had one final question for the panel, and then we'll try to get some audience questions.
In terms of the Copyright Office's role in developing a search, I think the Copyright Office should focus its energy entirely on updating its records, because if people could find, the rights holder, this would really, when people want to ask permission, they already know their use isn't fair. They want to find the rights holder. They want to engage with that person. So I would focus on updating the records. I also wanted to point out that with audiovisual materials, librarians, teachers, everybody, they can easily find the rights holder. The problem with audiovisual is that the rights holder doesn't respond. And the reason why they don't respond is because a library or a school wanting to use some footage from a film, they're not going to be able to really collect the kinds of money they can versus NBC wanting to use, footage from their film. So they often put the nonprofit kind of requests over to the side, and maybe that is a problem that they need to address, because we never hear back from these people.
Thank you, Ms. Russell. And I had one final question for the panel. I'm not sure who wants to talk about this a little bit. It's about the EU directive and how over there, once you do your reasonably diligent search, assume we've all figured it out what it's going to be and you've done it and you've found nobody. At that point, they make a record. So online, anyone can search it and have kind of a registry. And at that point, also, other people can kind of tack on to that, unless the Orphan Works owner appears. And so I wondered if people had thoughts on making a registry or any kind of tag-along users of Orphan Works. Ms. Rager?
That was actually something I was going to bring up, but I didn't know if it was appropriate in this case. I think that however we proceed with Orphan Works in the United States, taking the advisement of how they're doing it in the EU is important, and making that registry available so that it becomes part of the record. That's part of the one of the things that didn't get brought up in the first, and it didn't get brought up here, is that what we're really talking about with Orphan Works is a problem because of the copyright law. In 1988, when we signed on to the Berne Convention, you no longer had to put the copyright sign on to have a copyright, and you can't do formalities anymore and all that kind of good stuff. So the rights holders and the creators are now the ones that we're coming back to, 20 years later almost, and saying, yeah, well, now your stuff is considered an orphan, so do something about it. So if we go down that road, then let's make this part of the process.
Mr. Rosenthal?
Yeah, I would probably, if you're going down the road of trying to think of using a registry of some kind, is again to look at the free market. I think what you're talking about here is somewhat of a Creative Commons approach, where you would have some kind of a registry, but I'm not sure whether it would be the government that's the best place to do it, or whether you would have some kind of an organization outside of government handling this kind of a thing, where someone actually not just would have an Orphan Works, what they believe it's an Orphan Works and we're going to register it, but maybe they want to do that. And therefore you have an opportunity, like in the Creative Commons approach, where once I register, I know that all the libraries can use it, and all the, maybe non-commercial uses, maybe even commercial uses, that they can go down that road and use it. And just the last point, I just wanted to say to Nancy, I've never heard of a label disavowing ownership of a track, but I have heard of tracks where multiple labels claim ownership.
Nope.
And that's where you have a lot of mom and dads.
I can show you lists.
Yeah, no,
from
I
years and years.
understand that.
And I can also put you in touch with lots of music clearance people
Yeah.
who come up with the same issues.
But
So
here is the reality. You have Sound Exchange out there with databases of sound recordings and artists, ASCAP, BMI with songwriters. I think you're probably, I'm not saying that you
I will
won't do
address
it,
the
but,
problems with those databases in the next thing, but including in
Yes.
Sound Exchange, where foreign labels that don't have any rights to the underlying sound recordings are collecting the payments on the royalties because they're listed as the owner of that part. So
I
I'm
understand the
happy to talk
problems
to
of
you
Sound Exchange.
I think
No,
this might
no,
be
no,
a
no.
discussion for a different
That's
place.
a different topic. The
I
point
wanted to
is
give.
there's databases. That's the point.
I wanted, because time is short, I wanted to give Mr. Capobianco and Mr. Lerner the last word. Before I went forward, I wanted to make clear when I talk about the EU directive, they're not trying to make their intent does not appear to be to make a list of things that people can just use freely. It's more to make a list of works so that the owners can find out if people are using them. So the owners can come and either claim them back or negotiate of something. So it's not an attempt to make kind of a free-for-all on the use part. Mr. Capobianco and then Mr. Lerner, and then we'll see if there are
Yeah.
questions.
Well, as far as a government-run registry, I can think of two ways of doing it. One would be to have a registry of prospective orphan work publications. In other words, you'd put the information on this registry saying, I intend to publish this, and there should be like a 6 or 8 month period during which that would stand up there, and then that would give it a chance for the rights holder of the work to find in other words, reversing the process.
Sounds like the
Rights-
Trademark Gazette.
Yeah.
They publish the pending trademarks.
Yeah, something like that. And then, of course, what you were just saying, also having an ongoing registry of orphan works that have been demonstrated to be orphan works, so that someone would not have to redo the search for them, because these would be permanently labeled orphan works until someone came forward maybe and said, no, that's not an orphan work.
Okay, Mr. Lerner?
Jack Lerner, I just want to respond to Ms. Temple-Clagett's question about the Copyright Office involvement, and we do have a lot to say about a registry of proposed works, but we can talk about that after lunch. I think the experience with the best practices has been a good one, and we see because there haven't been a lot of problems. In fact, there haven't been a single problem that I know of with these best practices, and so I think we should replicate that process. The Copyright Office could get involved, but I don't think that's necessary. I think what we want to do is let the private market do its thing, and some people and some communities and some industries will undoubtedly contact rights holder groups and talk about registries run by rights holders and so on, and some won't, and that should be decided by those industries. What we don't want to do is another photocopying guidelines from the 70s that don't get used ever. And what we don't want is a Canadian system that also doesn't get used ever. So if you want these to actually get used, the best way to do it is to let the private market do its thing, let insurance companies and other gatekeepers serve as a check to that, and ultimately, if you support legislation that limits remedies, what you'll end up doing is supercharging that process in a way that ends up finding a ton of rights holders that aren't being found yet because of the education function, and you'll find out, and you'll end up with a lot of compensated uses, and we think that's the way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Lerner, and I think we're out of time at this point, so I would like to see if there's anyone from the audience who had a question.
I'm Jonathan Ban with the Library Copyright Alliance, and just very quickly to respond to give my view on the question about the best practices and who should be involved in that process. Certainly in a perfect world, it would be great if you could have, if there was an affected industry or a group of rights holders, it would be great if you had the user community sit down with the owner community and work out best practices. But again, this is not a perfect world. What would happen is you would have a 3, 4, 5-year negotiation. You either would never reach an agreement, or the agreement would be so complex that it would be useless, or would be so general as it would be useless. So again, in this world, a much better solution is to do exactly what's been happening, which is user communities come up with their best practices. So far, the owner community has sort of complained about the fact that the user community has come up with their best practices, but they've never actually come up with any specific objections to those best practices. But I would suggest that they should come up with their specific objections, and then a user could look at the best practices developed by the user community. They could look at the addendum or the dissent or whatever developed by the owner community, and then they do what they think is right. The likelihood of ever anyone objecting, meaning any owner coming out of the woodwork, is infinitesimally small. If there is a problem, at that point, a court could look at it and see whether the diligent search was performed. But the notion of trying to sort of delay this process at the outset by trying to basically have the Copyright Office supervise, 50 negotiations between rights holders and users, I think is just a complete waste of time for everyone involved.
I have a question. A recurring theme in your conversation is the distinction between commercial and non-commercial uses. We're talking today in part about orphan works and mass digitization that aims to put works up on the open internet and that makes these works exploitable for indirect uses, for advertising, data collection, data tracking, and profiling of searches. The advertising and the data collection that goes on already is very profitable for technology companies. Should there be a different diligence search standard for isolated uses and mass uses that in some way, I think it's fair to say, are always commercial because of the indirect uses that are made by the technology sector?
That is a good point, Ms. Pilch. That was actually something that was raised in some of the comments. I think it's the opposite of what you're saying, though. Some of the comments were saying that nonprofit enterprises should not really have more of a relaxed diligent search requirement, although on the other hand, some of these nonprofits are probably some of the people who could do the best searches. So it's an interesting theory. I don't know if anyone wants to briefly talk about it, as in very briefly. Mr. Harbeson.
I'm not sure that I would agree that all mass digitization efforts are necessarily commercial efforts. I would say that we definitely feel that any solution to the orphan works problem that is done legislatively needs to apply to work both for item level digitization or uses and collection level digitization efforts, which is how we see the mass digitization. There has to be a way not only to make a decision based on an individual item search, but also a folder of letters from a particular person or something like that.
We got some comments, Mr. Rosenthal and then Mr. Capobianco.
Yeah, just to respond to Jonathan, I think that the focus here should be to try, as all copyright should be, to facilitate licensing. So the process of creating best practices, whether it is before we have a bill like Ben has suggested or as we get towards a bill and work through, I think is just a fantastic thing to do. The more that the content industry can educate the user industry on where these rights are and how to get to them, and again, I come back to music and I'm thinking in terms of, well, how does a library know about digital samples within a sound recording that might trigger other ownership issues? How would you know that unless you really communicate with the user the content owners? And I think it's a very positive thing to do.
Mr. Capobianco.
Hi, yeah, to me, it seems that the concepts of mass digitization and diligent search are incompatible. There really is no way to do a diligent search on a mass basis. It has to be an individualized search.
Okay. And then I think we have one final question from the audience, Mr. Hansen.
Hi, Dave Hansen, UC Berkeley. So there were a number of comments on this panel about the EU directive and the kind of approach that it took to diligent search, this kind of combined minimum standard with some other things built in there. And I just wanted to give a word of caution about that because from what I have heard so far from European libraries and being involved in workshops there and things like that, is that they view that approach and at least the standards that are built into the directive right now as being, for the most part, unworkable for them and not very useful, at least for digitization efforts. And that's notable because the EU directive is aimed primarily at libraries and archives and other nonprofit uses like that. So I think in terms of the Copyright Office studying that, it would be well worth the effort to talk to European institutions, not the ones that were involved with passing the directive, but those that are actually impacted by it and trying to use it to assess whether that is an effective approach. Because from what I've heard, it so far is not.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.